Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the fourth in a series of mini-lectures on Charles Dickens's Great Expectations. Today we're going to talk about pity, guilt, and shame. We've spent a good deal of time on the background and opening scenes of the novel. I hope you've been reading ahead, getting caught up in the story, and enjoying Dickens's peculiar sense of humor. Today we're going to look at the narrative structure of Volume 1, with special attention to the way it's organized by the key emotions of pity, guilt, and shame. We'll go on in the next couple of mini-lectures, then, to talk more about the way these forces shape the development of Pip's character, and about the way guilt especially, buried in the unconscious, gains power over Pip's motives and actions in ways he doesn't want to recognize. Volume 1 lays the groundwork for this story. The action unfolds in 3 movements. These movements cover a period of about 5 years, taking Pip from age 7 to age 12. The first movement takes place on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, when Pip is 7. This movement is dominated by the conflict Pip feels between pity for the convict Magwitch and guilt over helping him. The second movement unfolds over the following year, ending when Pip is apprenticed to learn the blacksmith's trade from Joe Gargery. It's dominated by Pip's sense of shame in the presence of Estella at Miss Havisham's great house. Shame that only serves to reinforce his underlying guilt, since, on some level, he knows it is wrong to be ashamed of Joe and Biddy. The third movement stretches over the next 4 years, ending when Pip, at the age of 12, learns about his great expectations and departs for London. This section introduces a new force shaping Pip's character, ambition, which seems to promise an escape from the shame Pip feels over his low origins. The first movement covers 6 chapters. We've seen how traumatic the opening is, with little Pip surprised in the churchyard and threatened with death by the desperate convict Magwitch. As this overview suggests, the trauma of the opening scene sets in motion the 2 forces, pity and guilt, that dominate the ensuing chapters. For all the emphasis on violence and terror in the opening scene, the keynote of Pip's relation to Magwitch turns out to be pity. After his first ravenous assault on the food Pip has brought, Magwitch hears a sound and asks, "You're not a deceiving imp? You brought no one with you?" "No, sir, no." "Nor give no one the office to follow you?" "No." "Well," said he, "I believe you. You'd be but a fierce young hound indeed, if at your time of life you could help to hunt a wretched warmint, hunted as near death and dunghill as this poor wretched warmint is." Something clicked in his throat, as if he had works in him like a clock, and was going to strike, and he smeared his ragged rough sleeve over his eyes. Seeing Magwitch suffer and feel sorry for himself, Pip identifies with him. We've seen why this might be. Pip's older sister, Mrs. Joe, is as angry and abusive as any wicked stepmother in a fairy tale, so Pip knows what it is to feel wretched and unjustly hunted. In fact, when he gets back to the cottage, Joe tells Pip that his sister has been out searching for him. He, too, is a fugitive. The odd detail Pip notices, the click in the throat as Magwitch registers his pity, shows that Pip's response is not really sentimental. He can perceive the outward signs of grief in Magwitch as purely mechanical. Not a sob and tears, but a click in the throat and a rough smearing of his sleeve across his eyes. Yet without sentimentality, Pip nevertheless is moved by simple fellow feeling for the same man who terrified him the night before. Pitying his desolation and watching him as he gradually settled down upon the pie, I made bold to say, "I'm glad you enjoy it." "Did you speak?" "I said I was glad you enjoyed it." "Thank you, my boy. I do." This passage is followed by a long description of the way Magwitch eats, which reminds Pip of the rushed and fearful way he has seen a dog eat, literally wolfing down its food. Like the mechanical click in the throat, this description validates the moment of pity by anchoring it not in a gush of high-flown sentimentality, but in the dispassionately reckoned details of the moment, which make the spectacle of human suffering far more real. This is a crucial moment, so pay attention and remember it. Because of Pip's compassion, what began as an act of theft under duress is converted in this moment to a gift. This conversion, in which the stolen food becomes a gift, gives rise to a cycle of generosity. At the end of Chapter 5, Magwitch, captured and on his way back to the prison ship, sees Pip and returns his kindness by taking the blame for the stolen pork pie, apologizing to Joe. Joe's reply recalls and confirms Pip's moment of compassion. "God knows you're welcome to it, so far as it was ever mine," returned Joe with a saving remembrance of Mrs. Joe. "We don't know what you've done, but we wouldn't have you starved to death for it, poor miserable fellow creature. Would us, Pip?" The connection between this spirit of generosity and the Christmas season is barely noted in the narrative, but we'd be wrong to miss it. The contrast between this simple moment and the elaborate Christmas dinner back at the Gargerys, with all its unpleasantness and hypocrisy, is heavy with irony. These moments of pity based on compassion for human suffering mark a turning point in the narrative. It is followed quickly, though, by a second force that works against the redemptive value of pity in Pip's childish mind: the feeling of guilt. Stealing food from his sister's pantry makes Pip feel terribly guilty. In his own mind, this associates him with the convict Magwitch. In this way, it helps him identify with Magwitch, even as it also makes him ashamed of that connection. Where compassion turns his forced theft of the food into a gift, guilt turns it into a crime. Pip wants to confess to Joe, but can't bear the thought of losing the trust of his only friend. In a word, he says, "I was too cowardly to do what I knew to be right, as I had been too cowardly to avoid doing what I knew to be wrong." The first movement of the novel closes by emphasizing this deep sense of guilt. My state of mind, as I have described it, began before I was up in the morning and lasted long after the subject had died out and had ceased to be mentioned, saving on exceptional occasions. The struggle in Pip between guilt and pity sets up the main conflict of the second movement, in which guilt gets transformed into shame. The action unfolds over the following year, and it details both the start of Pip's education and his weekly visits to Satis House. At Miss Havisham's, Pip meets Estella. Her name deliberately echoes that of the most famous mistress in the Petrarchan sonnet sequences of the Elizabethan period, Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella. Under the scornful gaze of Estella, shame enters the story to transform Pip's sense of guilt. These emotions are similar. Both involve a sense that one has been judged and found wanting, but shame carries with it a sense of public exposure, whereas guilt is proverbially secret. Pip's shame arises from markers of social status, such as his rough hands, his thick boots, and his coarse way of referring to knaves in a deck of cards as jacks. His guilt arises from a sense of having done wrong by stealing and lying. His shame is therefore more a matter of status, his guilt a matter of conscience. It's a sign that Pip is losing his moral compass when he begins to confuse these two feelings. Guilt loses itself in shame when Pip begins to feel that his connection with Magwitch is somehow coarse or vulgar. He refers to it as his low career and worries that it would lower him in Estella's eyes. This conversion of moral guilt into social shame is not only wrong in the abstract. Being poor is not like being criminal. it also suppresses in Pip the ability to feel the redemptive emotion of pity, and this difference is crucial to the story. Remember that Pip's guilt did not prevent him from empathizing with Magwitch. If anything, it made the identification with the convict easier for him. But his shame has just the opposite effect, separating him not only from Magwitch, who's no longer around anyway, but from those humble characters Joe and Biddy, who embody the love and compassion that make it possible to empathize and feel pity. It was Joe who shared Pip's moral impulse to sympathize with a poor, miserable fellow creature. As Pip starts to feel ashamed of Joe, he more and more deeply represses that moral impulse as itself something shameful. To recap, Pip's childhood in Volume 1 is shaped by the forces of pity, guilt, and shame. Pity and guilt are the feelings Magwitch arouses in the little boy who feeds him. Compassion draws him closer to Magwitch. Guilt makes him want to pull away. Joe Gargery also expresses pity for the convict. Joe is the only person Pip can safely love and trust. In pitying and protecting the convict, then, Pip is treating Magwitch the way Joe treats him when he tries to shield the little boy from Mrs. Joe's rampages. But because he conceals it from Joe, Pip comes to experience his pity for Magwitch as a source of guilt. This connection between pity and guilt in the little boy is in this way linked both to Magwitch and to Joe Gargery. These men remain oddly connected throughout the novel, although after their first encounter they never meet again. In their different ways, they are both surrogate fathers to Pip. For different reasons, he feels shame that makes him want to repress both his connection to them and the impulse to pity that he associates with them. Pip fights back against his sense of shame by replacing pity with another emotion: ambition. The desire to rise in status, to realize those great expectations which will carry him farther and farther away from his humble origins. But this desire will also isolate Pip from those who love him, and in this way will both intensify his guilt and take him back to the isolation of the opening scene. In a sense, he is still that small boy, orphaned, shivering, and alone out on the cold, bare marsh.